So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just try and give an overview of the different aspects of this historiographical debate, what evidence has been used to suggest that there is a crisis and what evidence has been used to suggest that there is not. And what I suggest you do is think about all the time as I'm making these comments is how that fits in with what I've already been saying about, well, what does this agrarian crisis mean and for whom? So let's start with no crisis. So those who argue that there wasn't a crisis at the turn of the century among the agrarian population start by saying that redemption dues were stable between 1861 and 1900. Redemption dues are the payments that the government demanded of the previously enserfed peasants in order to essentially pay for their freedom, and they were taxed really, so they had to give a payment to the state which would go on for 40 years in order to buy off their obligations to their landlords. Now these redemption payments, the arrears on these payments remained stable, they argue, between 1861 and 1900. So you'd say, well, you know, if the peasant population were really struggling, they wouldn't have been continuing to pay these arrears, to pay these redemption payments. They would have actually been refusing or withholding these payments, and therefore the level of arrears would have increased. So there's one evidence of crisis, is the way that historians are trying to get into peasants' lives. You know, if you're paying your taxes, you're not too bad. There's one thing. Another indicator which has been used by historians is the increased consumption of luxury goods, and I use luxury with care here. When they talk about luxury goods, they're talking about matches, kerosene, tea and sugar. These are things which are considered by historians to be non-essential goods, right? So they say, well, if we look at the figures for Russia nationally, we see that people are buying more and more matches, tea, kerosene, sugar. And this is an indication that overall prosperity is increasing. Well, that's grand. There are some problems with this, however. The first thing is, how do we define what is a luxury and how do we define what is a necessity? In every culture, in every population, there are different levels of what is and is not necessary. And also these things can quickly become habituated, so that if you become accustomed to, for example, burning a kerosene lamp in the evenings, then this becomes a necessity. It is no longer a luxury product which you've splashed out on, but rather it's one of your daily needs. And how we determine what people consider to be necessary and what people consider to be luxury is a very difficult problem. Another issue with this particular argument that there was no crisis is that they're usually looking at national figures for consumption. They say, well, they go up in this period a lot. Well, that's fine. However, in this period, Russia's urban areas increased massively. The cities went from being small and sparse to big, with lots of people living in urban areas. Now, in urban areas, you're much more likely to have very high consumption of these luxury items like tea, sugar, kerosene. So you could argue that the increase in consumption comes from the growth of urban areas. So these are both kind of stumbling points for this particular argument. What you need to do as a budding historian is to try and work out, well, how do you evaluate it? There isn't an answer, but there are lots of problems. Another argument that there was no crisis is that the amount of cash in the rural economy was increasing because more and more peasants were working as wage labourers. That is, they were going into urban areas to work in factories and workshops, or they were producing goods in their own homes and then selling them, so that they were obtaining more cash. And this cash made them richer and more able to buy things and more able to improve their homes. It gave them different opportunities, different alternatives. I'll counter that one in a bit when I get to the crisis argument. Another argument for no crisis, and it kind of comes along with this idea of more cash, is improved standard of living. And I think I've already mentioned the kind of indices that historians might use to argue that there was an increased standard of living. So, for example, they might look at the brick houses with chimneys, without chimneys, the use of, another thing which I think is quite interesting is that they might look at fashions, that increasingly young peasant women were looking to wear printed cloths. that have been made in a factory rather than just the old traditional homespun, home weaved things. And so you can look at changing fashions of what is attractive in the countryside as indicators of increasing wealth in the countryside as well. Another argument that there was no crisis, that people were doing quite well by the turn of the century, is the growth in population. Russia's population booms in the latter part of the 19th century, and some historians have argued that, well, if mortality is decreasing, less people are dying, more children are being born and more children are surviving, then people are doing better because their children are surviving. That's a good thing. So there's another argument in favour of a kind of a better condition in the countryside. And finally, in favour of the no crisis argument, historians have pointed out that in some areas, and this is where we get our regional problems again, but in some areas, different grains are the main food source. Usually, when they talk about agrarian problems, historians talk about wheat, which is the main grain which is used in white bread. Well, wheat is one indicator of what peasants were producing. However, wheat isn't the be-all and end-all for all peasant consumers. It's the main grain that was exported, so it's very important for people who care about the growth of Russia's economy. However, in some areas, most peasants grew rye grain, which is a dark grain. They grew rye to eat, and wheat less so. Wheat was more of an export grain. So historians who say there wasn't a crisis are basically saying, well, it doesn't matter what happened to wheat prices. This is immaterial for Russia's peasant population. What really matters is that the rye supply is continuing because that's what people eat. So there's just some of the kind of problems that we face when we're looking at this agrarian crisis. So what are the main arguments that the crisis people have come up with? Well, they argue that the redemption dues, the thing that we started talking about, were in arrears. And that they continued to be in arrears and that the arrears got bigger. So for a start, we've got how do they interpret this data, how do they interpret this information. But also, I suppose, it's a matter of how they interpret what these arrears mean. So I'm sure that if I were arguing that there wasn't a crisis, I would say that, yes, but they choose not to pay. That the peasants are confident not to pay. This is what some historians have argued. The crisis people, however, argued that peasants didn't have a choice, that they didn't dare not pay because the punitive measures, that is the punishment that they faced if they didn't pay their dues, was very severe. So here we have a problem of how we interpret this evidence. Another point that the crises school might come up with would be the frequency of famine and the frequency of epidemics. Epidemics being like cholera, that kill lots of people, often attack in times of poverty and dearth when the population is weakest. And they usually attack the weakest parts of the population as well, that is children and the elderly. And so they would point out the frequency of famine in Russia, and particularly that big famine in 1891, and say this is an indication that the rural population can't cope anymore, that we're getting to a point of absolute crisis where the population cannot feed itself adequately. However, if you're arguing against a crisis, you would say that these sorts of famines and epidemics are periodic, that they are part of rural life because sometimes crops fail. And that in fact, if we can talk about a crisis, it would just be in terms of how the government responds to that crisis and not the famine or epidemic itself. So there's another one. Those who argue that there's a crisis, they can't deny that there's population growth in the 19th century because there's a lot of it. But they can argue that the population growth contributes to crisis because as families get bigger, it puts more pressure on resources and it puts more pressure on land reserves. So historians have argued that the increase of population led to an increase of poverty and destitution for Russia's rural population. Another one. So we had our no crisis people argued that the increase in wage labour was a positive aspect. It meant there's more cash coming into the rural economy. However, if you were arguing for a crisis, you would say that the increase in wage labour was actually an indication of crisis because, so the argument goes, peasants don't want to leave the village and they only go into wage labour because of utter desperation, that they're forced into the urban areas. And I mean, I have to say that strikes me as a rather old-fashioned approach, and it denies agency on the part of the rural population. It denies individual young peasants their opportunity as young people to say, well, actually, maybe there are some chances for me in the city. And what we see when we read peasant memoirs is that although there are mixed feelings about working in urban areas for different groups within the rural population, it's certainly the case that for some young men, working in the city was considered to be both necessary and even possibly advantageous, that it made you a better bridegroom when you came back as a wealthier, more worldly man. So I would be cautious again about this. It can't be answered in a straightforward way, but it's certainly something that we need to consider is, well, how much did peasants go and how far were they pushed when they went out into wage labour? Another area, and this is a difficult one if you're going to argue about crisis, is a sense of heightened expectations. So this is where you could say, okay, maybe people in the countryside are taking more sugar with their tea, drinking more tea, they have more lights on in their huts with their kerosene, and they're striking matches a bit more frequently. But that this actually heightens expectation of daily life. And you can argue that what really produces a crisis is where people have high expectations or higher expectations of what daily life should be for them. And that these higher expectations are then undermined. They do not get what they expected. So where people feel disappointed by their conditions of life, then this is dangerous and critical and a crisis in a way that just having poor conditions all the time is not. Again, it's a difficult one. So I hope that I've tried to outline some aspects of this problem of agrarian crisis and what it meant and why it is that historians have argued about it and what they've argued around. In terms of conclusions, the first thing I'd say is that it's up to an individual scholar to try and pull together these different factors and make sense of them, to make an argument of it. And I would encourage you always to think about geographical diversity, the base of sources, how these sources are used, and what different interpretations could be made when you think about the different approaches to an agrarian crisis. And finally, I would encourage you to think about whose crisis. Is this a crisis for the rural population? Are they feeling that this is a critical point, a turning point, a moment of crisis? Or is it a problem for the elites? And what sort of crisis? Is it a crisis because they feel that the rural population is suffering? Is it a crisis because they feel that Russia's economy isn't growing fast enough? Is it a crisis for the autocracy because the Tsar fears that the rural population is getting restless, is getting dangerous? And so those are the things that I'll leave you with, as whether there was an agrarian crisis in Russia.